And moving on, the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly impacted the world business economy. But despite the work-from-home models and market insecurity, many global and Israeli tech companies have adapted and thrived. And in fact, this year, more investments than ever have poured into Israeli enterprise. That said, there are still a number of issues plaguing the industry. So just how has the pandemic affected the Israeli high-tech scene? Joining me to discuss is Meir Valman, Director of the Research Department at Startup Nation Central. Welcome. So we're coming out of a worldwide pandemic, and many countries actually are still in the midst of it. And yet we hear that the startup and tech scene has flourished in many areas. So looking at a global scale to begin with, how has the pandemic impacted the high-tech scene?
So it's very interesting. The high-tech scene has been one of the big winners coming out of the pandemic. The initial cause was really government policies in many parts of the world. So easy monetary policy, support for the stock market, and that allowed money to keep flowing into the high-tech scene. But more fundamentally than that, what we saw was actually a big change in the way people work and the way people live, which tremendously benefited the sector. So if you think about how we change the way we work, if we will start working remotely, this is something that we hadn't done before, but it requires many kinds of new systems in order to work. And the high-tech sector was able to provide many of the solutions that were needed there. If you think about the way we changed in the way we live, e-commerce was something that's been around for a while, but adoption of it was quite low in many areas. Once the pandemic came along, people had to be locked up at home. Almost every shop had to have an online presence, otherwise it simply couldn't survive. And many people had to learn how to shop online who hadn't before. So, my parents in their 80s never shopped online before, had to do all their grocery shopping online. They simply learned what to do, and suddenly online shopping went through the roof. And the payment systems needed to run that also needed to be adapted and bought by many customers in order to enable that to happen.
Now let's take a look specifically at Israel. I mean, we've seen a major increase in the number of investments pouring into Israeli startups. So why is this the case? I mean, did Israel do something differently than the rest of the world?
So the Israeli ecosystem is very unique in many ways. The nature of the ecosystem is such that we have an emphasis on the software sector. And particularly three sectors I'd like to point out who have benefited the most. There's a cybersecurity, fintech, and enterprise software. These are all pure software sectors, and these are all sectors which saw a huge increase in demand as a result of the pandemic. So this is something about the Israeli ecosystem which is most suited to provide these solutions. The timing was also particularly good. So a lot of Israeli startups had reached the stage whereby they had a product, it was a released product, and when demand increased for their products, they could suddenly supply a lot more of it, and sales could increase to the people who needed it. And because it's software, it's much easier to be able to increase that production and to supply it to those people who wanted it.
Now, we've seen a boost in certain sectors, as you mentioned, but what about, were there any sectors that experienced the opposite, that were hard hit?
So the software sectors were the ones who benefited the most. On the opposite side, those with more of a hardware component had some other issues. So, for example, to develop hardware-related solutions is much harder with a remote workforce. It's harder to ramp up production very quickly. It's also harder to supply it to the people who need it. So that's one area where things have been more difficult. Other sectors were also sectors where they're transformative solutions, but they're not really urgent. They're not things that have to happen overnight, even with the pandemic. So if we take the industrial sphere, for example, there's many great solutions which will transform factories over the next 10 years. But the major issue for factories during the pandemic was simply keeping the factories open and keeping things going, whereas these kinds of solutions will take many years to be able to implement. If you look in the healthcare sphere as well, there's also many great solutions in healthcare. They were put on hold because of the pandemic. The healthcare sector was focused mainly on pandemic-related solutions, and much of the research, much of the development in those areas is going to have to wait for a few years now until things clear, because the urgency has simply dissipated.
To get back on track. Now, we have new investments coming in, but there still are sort of major problems that the Israeli tech ecosystem has faced. And I'm talking mainly, of course, about the huge gap in skilled labor. So, I mean, how has the pandemic affected this shortage, and what can we expect looking forward?
So, the problems in the Israeli ecosystem today are typically problems of too much rather than too few. And as you mentioned, skilled labor is probably the biggest problem of the lot. So we've been looking at this at Startup Nation Central for some time now. We did a survey pre-pandemic, and we found there was a shortage of around 30,000 workers in areas such as programming engineers, that kind of thing. We did another survey last year towards the end of the pandemic, but demand was still down at that point. It went down to about 15,000. We strongly suspect that when we do the survey again soon, the number will be much higher because demand has simply gone through the roof. And the numbers have really haven't increased. So this is going to be a big problem, continue to be a big problem. It's an issue that the government is trying to deal with as much as possible. At Startup Nation Central, we're running courses to help underrepresented minority populations gain the skills to be able to work in this area. And other bodies as well are also running similar kind of courses. But it will take time. To cover this number of vacancies will take many years. And also the problem is kind of spread beyond just the pure programming area. As companies scale up, they also need people in other areas, sales and marketing, finance, things like that. And there's a shortage of qualified workers in those areas as well. So we're going to need to do some more work to improve the qualified worker pool in that area as well.
Absolutely. All right, Meir Valman from Startup Nation Central, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much.